The auction barn smelled like rotting hay and fear. Gideon Cole stood at the back, hat pulled low, shoulders hunched against the weight of what he was witnessing. The auctioneer's voice rolled through the dim space like thunder across a dead prairie, rough, practiced, indifferent. Next lot, female, 22 years old, no living kin, no debts attached, clean bill of health far as we know. Gideon's jaw tightened. The woman was led onto the platform by a man with a scar slicing through his eyebrow. Her wrists were bound in front of her with frayed rope, her ankles linked by a short length of chain that forced her to shuffle. She wore a faded cotton dress that might have once been blue, now grey with dust and wear. Her dark hair hung in tangles around her face, and she kept her eyes locked on the floorboards. She didn't look up, not once. "Don't look there," she whispered. It wasn't loud. Gideon barely heard it over the murmur of the crowd, but he saw her lips move, saw the way her shoulders curled inward like she was trying to fold herself into nothing. The auctioneer grinned, teeth stained yellow. "She's got some fire left in her, boys. Might need a firm hand, but she'll work. Start the bidding at $20. A man in a stained wool coat raised his hand. 20. Another voice from the side. 25. Gideon felt his stomach twist. This wasn't supposed to still be happening. The war had ended 4 years ago. Slavery was illegal. But out here, in the forgotten corners of the West, the law was whatever men with guns said it was. And in towns like Dust Hollow, auctions like this still thrived in hidden barns, under the protection of men who wore badges and called it contract labor. The woman's breathing quickened. Her fingers trembled where they clutched the rope binding her wrists. 30, someone called. 35. Gideon's hand moved before his mind caught up. He raised 2 fingers. 40, he said. The room went quiet for a beat. Heads turned. The auctioneer squinted at him through the lantern light. 40 from the man in the back. Anyone willing to go higher? The man in the wool coat scowled, but he didn't bid again. Neither did anyone else. The auctioneer slammed his palm against the wooden podium. Sold, $40 to the quiet one. Gideon moved forward through the crowd, pulling a small leather pouch from his coat. He counted out the coins slowly, deliberately, while the auctioneer watched with a reptilian smile. "Pleasure doing business," the man said, sliding the money into his vest. "She's all yours now. Do what you want with her." Gideon didn't respond. He turned toward the platform where the woman stood, still staring at the floor. The man with the scar shoved her forward. She stumbled, the chain between her ankles rattling. Gideon caught her by the elbow before she fell. She flinched at his touch. "Easy," he said quietly. "I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't answer. Her body was rigid, her breathing shallow. He could feel the tremor running through her arm. He pulled a folding knife from his belt and opened it. She jerked back, eyes wide. "Hold still," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'm cutting the ropes." She froze, her gaze flicked to his face, then back to the knife. Slowly, hesitantly, she extended her bound wrists. Gideon sliced through the rope with 2 clean cuts. It fell away, leaving red marks on her skin. He knelt and cut the chain at her ankles next, the metal links clattering to the dirt floor. She rubbed her wrists, staring at him like he was a puzzle she couldn't solve. "What's your name?" Gideon asked. She didn't answer right away. Her eyes darted toward the auctioneer, who was watching from across the room with his arms crossed. "Sarah," she finally whispered. "Sarah," Gideon repeated. He nodded once. "I'm Gideon, come on, let's get out of here." He turned toward the door. She didn't move. Gideon stopped, glancing back. "You coming?" "You paid for me," she said quietly. Her voice was flat, hollow. "So do it, whatever you're going to do." Gideon's chest tightened. He looked at her, really looked at her, at the exhaustion carved into her face, the way she held herself like someone who'd learned not to hope for anything. "I'm not going to do anything," he said, "except get you out of this place." She blinked. Confusion flickered across her face, followed by suspicion. "Why?" "Because it's the right thing to do." Nobody does the right thing, she said. Not for free. Gideon held her gaze. I'm not asking for anything, Sarah. I couldn't leave you here. She studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face for a lie. Then, slowly, she took a step forward. And another. They walked out of the barn together, into the cool night air. The stars were scattered across the sky like broken glass. Gideon's horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Rust, stood tied to a post near the edge of the clearing. Sarah stopped a few paces from the horse, her arms wrapped around herself. Where are we going? She asked. My ranch, Gideon said. It's about an hour's ride north. You'll be safe there. She let out a bitter laugh. Safe, I don't even know what that means anymore. Gideon untied Rust's reins and turned back to her. Then let me show you. She didn't say anything, but when he offered his hand to help her onto the horse, she took it. They rode in silence through the dark, the only sounds the creak of leather and the steady rhythm of Rust's hooves on the hard-packed earth. Sarah sat in front of Gideon, her back straight, her hands gripping the saddle horn. She didn't lean against him, didn't relax. Gideon didn't push her to talk. He just kept his eyes on the road and tried not to think about the weight of what he'd just done. Or the weight of what he hadn't done 8 years ago. Because when the lantern light had caught Sarah's face back in that barn, when he'd seen the thin white scar running along her left temple, his heart had stopped. He knew that scar. He'd wrapped the wound himself. The ranch house was small but solid, rough-cut timber, a stone chimney, a porch that sagged slightly on one side. Gideon led Sarah inside and lit a lantern on the table. The golden light pushed back the shadows, revealing a simple main room with a wood stove, a table, 2 chairs, and a narrow cot in the corner. Sarah stood just inside the doorway, her arms still wrapped around herself. You can sleep there, Gideon said, nodding toward the cot. I'll take the floor. She didn't move. Sarah, he said gently, you're safe here, I mean that. Why do you keep saying that? She asked. Her voice was sharper now, edged with something raw. You don't know me, you don't owe me anything. Gideon set the lantern down and turned to face her. His throat felt tight. I know, he said quietly, but I should have known you a long time ago. Sarah frowned. What are you talking about? Gideon hesitated. Then he stepped closer, just enough that the light caught his face clearly. 8 years ago, he said, there was a farm near the Gallatin River, the Turner Farm. Sarah's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes. There was a fire, Gideon continued. Raiders came through in the night, burned the house, killed the family. Sarah's breathing quickened. I was there, Gideon said. I was riding with a supply wagon for the Union Army. We were camped a mile away. I heard the screams, saw the smoke, and I rode toward it. Sarah's hands clenched into fists. I found a girl, Gideon said, maybe 14 years old. She was crawling through the grass, bleeding from a gash on her head. I stopped. I wrapped the wound. I gave her water. And then, his voice cracked. And then I heard gunfire from the direction of our camp. My captain was calling for me, so I left her there. I told myself someone else would find her, that she'd be okay. Sarah's face was pale. Her jaw trembled. I rode back to camp, Gideon said, and I never went back to check. I never asked what happened to her. I just kept moving like a coward. Silence filled the room like smoke. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. You left me there. Gideon closed his eyes. Yes. You wrapped my head, you gave me water, and then you left me. Yes. Sarah took a step forward, then another. Her eyes were burning now, not with tears but with something hotter. Do you know what happened after you left? She asked. Gideon shook his head. I crawled, Sarah said, for hours until I reached the road. A man found me. He said he'd take me to town. He said he'd help me. Her voice turned brittle. Instead, he sold me to a contractor in Montana. I've been sold 4 times since then, 4 times, Gideon, and every time I remembered the man who stopped, the man who could have helped me, and I hated him. Gideon's chest felt like it was caving in. I don't expect you to forgive me, he said. I needed you to know. I saw you tonight and I knew, and I couldn't leave you again." Sarah stared at him. Her hands were shaking. "You think that makes it better," she said. "No. You think buying me erases what you did." "No. Then what do you want from me?" "Nothing," Gideon said. "I don't want anything. I just want you to have a choice, for once, a real choice." Sarah's anger seemed to falter. Not gone, just cracked, like ice under weight. "A choice," she repeated. "You can stay here as long as you need," Gideon said. "I'll give you food, shelter, safety, no strings. And when you're ready, I'll take you wherever you want to go, or you can leave tonight. I won't stop you." Sarah looked around the room, at the cot, the stove, the window with its threadbare curtain. Then she looked back at Gideon. "You really think it's that simple?" she asked. "No," Gideon said, "but it's a start." Sarah was quiet for a long time. Then slowly she walked over to the cot and sat down. She didn't lie down, just sat there staring at her hands. "I'll stay," she said quietly, "for now." Gideon nodded. "Okay. But don't think I trust you," she added. "I don't. And don't think I've forgiven you." "I won't." Sarah looked up at him. Her eyes were hard, guarded. But beneath that, Gideon saw something else, something fragile and bruised. "Good," she said. Gideon grabbed a blanket from a trunk near the door and spread it on the floor near the stove. He lay down without another word, his back to her, giving her space. The lantern burned low. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines. Sarah lay down on the cot, pulling the thin quilt over herself. She stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. She remembered the man from that night 8 years ago, his voice, his hands, rough but careful, the way he'd looked at her like she mattered. And then the way he'd ridden away. She'd spent years hating him, years imagining what she'd say if she ever saw him again. But now that he was here, lying on the floor 3 feet away, she didn't know what to feel. Anger, yes, that was easy. But also something else, something she didn't have a name for. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep. Outside in the distance, a coyote howled. And somewhere farther out, hoofbeats echoed in the dark. Morning came slow and grey. Gideon woke to the sound of Sarah moving around the kitchen. He sat up, rubbing the stiffness from his shoulders, and saw her standing by the stove with a tin cup in her hands. She glanced at him, but didn't speak. He stood, folded the blanket, and stepped outside to check on Rust. The air was cool and damp, heavy with the smell of pine and earth. Gideon fed the horse, checked the fence line, and filled the water trough from the well. It was quiet work, familiar, grounding. When he came back inside, Sarah had set a plate of cornbread and beans on the table. "You didn't have to do that," Gideon said. "I know," she replied. She sat down across from him and ate in silence. They were halfway through the meal when the sound of hoofbeats reached them. Gideon's head snapped up. He set down his fork and moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to see out. 3 riders were coming up the road. 2 of them wore long coats. The third had a silver badge pinned to his chest. Gideon's stomach dropped. "Get in the back room," he said quietly. Sarah stood, her eyes wide. "Who is it?" "The law, or what passes for it out here." "They're coming for me." "Maybe, but I'm not letting them take you." Sarah's face went pale. "You don't understand. If they find me here." "Sarah, back room, now." She hesitated, then moved quickly toward the narrow door at the far end of the cabin. Gideon waited until it closed behind her, then stepped out onto the porch. The riders pulled to a stop in front of the house. The man with the badge dismounted first, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a thin mustache and cold eyes. His name was Eli Voss, and he'd been the sheriff of Dust Hollow for 6 years. He was also the man who'd led the raid on the Turner farm 8 years ago. Gideon had learned that 2 years after the fact, from a drunk soldier in a saloon. The man had bragged about how Sheriff Voss had called the Turners traitors to the Union cause, used it as cover to burn them out and claim their land. Gideon had never spoken a word of it to anyone. He'd been too ashamed. Because he'd been there, he'd heard the screams, and he'd done nothing. Voss smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Morning coal. Sheriff, Gideon said evenly. Heard you were at the auction last night. That a crime? Depends, heard you bought something, or someone. Gideon kept his face neutral. I bought a contract, legal purchase. That's so. Voss glanced at the two men behind him. One of them was the auctioneer. The other was a hired gun Gideon didn't recognize. See, the thing is, Cole, we got a complaint. Someone says you took property that wasn't rightfully sold. Property, Gideon repeated. That's right. She's not property, she's a person. Voss's smile widened. Well now, that's a matter of interpretation, isn't it? Gideon's jaw tightened. What do you want, Voss? I want to see the girl. No. That's not a request, Cole. It's my land, my house. You don't have a warrant, you don't come in. Voss's expression darkened. He took a step forward. You really want to do this? I really want you to leave. Voss stared at him for a long moment. Then he turned his head slightly, speaking to the man with the rifle. Check the barn. The man dismounted and walked toward the barn. Gideon didn't move. You know what your problem is, Cole, Voss said. You think you're better than the rest of us. You think you can ride in, play the hero, and nobody's gonna ask questions. I'm not playing anything. You're playing with fire. Voss leaned in closer. That girl you bought, she's got a history. People want her back, and if you get in the way, you're gonna regret it. Let them try. Voss smiled again. You always were. Stubborn. The hired gun came back from the barn, shaking his head. Voss sighed. Fine, he said. Keep her for now, but Cole, he pointed a gloved finger at Gideon's chest. You're making enemies you can't afford. I'll take my chances. Voss mounted his horse. The other two followed. They turned and rode back down the road, dust rising in their wake. Gideon stood on the porch until they were out of sight. Then he went inside. Sarah was standing in the doorway to the back room, her face pale. They're going to come back, she said. I know. And when they do, they'll kill you. Maybe. Sarah's hands clenched into fists. Then why are you doing this? Gideon looked at her, really looked at her. Because 8 years ago I walked away, he said, and I've regretted it every day since. I'm not walking away again. Sarah's eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. She just nodded once and turned back into the room. Gideon sat down at the table and stared at the cold cornbread. Outside, the wind picked up. And somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled. So let me ask you this. If you were Gideon, would you have opened that door 8 years ago? Would you have stayed, even if it cost you everything? Tap subscribe if you're still with me. I want to know what time it is for you right now and whether you think redemption is something you earn or something you fight for. Pour yourself some coffee and breathe with this story, because what comes next changes everything. The days that followed were quiet. Too quiet. Gideon went about his work, mending fences, feeding the livestock, chopping wood, but the weight of Voss's visit hung over him like storm clouds. He knew the sheriff would return. It was only a matter of time. Sarah stayed close to the house. She didn't talk much, but she worked. She swept the floor, washed clothes in the basin, and cooked simple meals. Gideon didn't ask her to. She just did it, like she needed to stay busy, like stillness made her too vulnerable. On the third evening, Gideon came in from the barn to find her sitting at the table, staring at her hands. He set down the bucket of water and pulled out the other chair. You okay? He asked. She didn't answer right away. I keep thinking about that night, she said quietly, the night my family died. Gideon's chest tightened. I was in the barn when it started, Sarah continued. I heard my mother screaming, my father shouting. I ran toward the house, but the door was already on fire. I couldn't get in, I just stood there, frozen. Her voice cracked. And then someone grabbed me from behind, dragged me into the grass, hit me with something, I don't even remember what, I just remember the pain, the blood, and then, you. Gideon said nothing. You were the first person who stopped, Sarah said, the first person who looked at me like I was still human, and then you left. I'm sorry, Gideon said, I know that doesn't mean much, but I am. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes were red, but she wasn't crying. Why didn't you come back? She asked. Because I was a coward, Gideon said. I told myself I had orders, that I couldn't disobey my captain, but the truth is I was scared, scared of what I'd find, scared of what it would mean if I stayed. And now I'm still scared, Gideon admitted, but I'm more scared of who I'd be if I ran again. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and touched the scar on her temple. You were gentle, she said. When you wrapped this, you didn't have to be. I'm sorry it wasn't enough. It wasn't, Sarah said, but it was something. Gideon met her gaze. There was still anger there, still pain, but there was something else too, something fragile and uncertain, like the first shoots of green after a fire. I don't know if I can forgive you, Sarah said. Not yet. I don't expect you to. But I think I want to try. Gideon felt something loosen in his chest, not relief, not absolution, just space, room to breathe. Thank you, he said quietly. Sarah nodded. Then she stood and went to the stove, stirring the pot of stew that had been simmering. Gideon watched her move, careful and deliberate, like she was learning how to exist in the world again. That night, after they'd eaten, Sarah asked him about the ranch. How long have you been here? She said. 4 years. Bought it with my discharge pay after the war. You live alone? Yeah. Why? Gideon shrugged. Guess I got used to it. Sarah tilted her head. Or maybe you didn't think you deserved company. Gideon didn't answer. He didn't need to. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling in the stove. Outside, an owl called from the trees. I used to have a brother, Sarah said suddenly. His name was Daniel. He was 10 when he died in the fire. Gideon's throat tightened. He loved horses, Sarah continued. Used to sneak out to the barn at night just to sit with them. Said they understood him better than people do. Sounds like a good kid. He was, Sarah's voice was soft. I think about him every day, wonder what he'd be like now, if he'd be proud of me or ashamed. He'd be proud, Gideon said. You don't know that. I do, because you survived, and that takes more strength than most people have. Sarah looked at him, her eyes searching his face. Then she smiled, just a little. It was the first time Gideon had seen her smile. Maybe, she said. They talked late into the night. Small things, memories, pieces of who they'd been before the world broke them. And for the first time in 8 years, Gideon felt like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't too far gone to be forgiven. But outside, in the dark, hoofbeats were coming closer. They came at dawn. Gideon was already awake, standing on the porch with a rifle in his hands. He'd heard the horses an hour before, moving slow through the trees. Voss wasn't trying to hide anymore. Sarah stood in the doorway behind him, her face pale. Go inside, Gideon said. No, Sarah. I'm not hiding anymore. Gideon looked back at her. There was steel in her eyes now, not the brittle kind that shatters, the kind that holds. He nodded. Voss rode into the clearing with 6 men behind him, more than before. They spread out in a loose semicircle, rifles resting across their saddles. Morning coal, Voss called. Last chance, hand her over and we'll call it even. She's not going anywhere, Gideon said. Voss sighed. You always were a fool. He raised his hand, signaling the men to dismount. They did, slow and deliberate, their hands drifting toward their guns. And then, from the tree line, a voice rang out. That's far enough. Voss spun in his saddle. A group of riders emerged from the trees, 7 of them, led by an older man with a grizzled beard and a weathered Stetson. His name was Henry Briggs, and he'd worked cattle with Gideon for the past 3 years. Behind him were other ranch hands from neighboring spreads, men Gideon had branded calves with, mended fences alongside, shared whiskey with on cold nights. Gids Gelding came home alone yesterday, Henry said, his voice calm but firm. We figured something was wrong, so we came looking. Voss's jaw tightened. This doesn't concern you, Briggs. Hell it doesn't. Cole's one of ours, and we don't let our own get pushed around by men hiding behind badges they don't deserve. One of the hired guns shifted nervously. Sheriff, maybe we should. Shut up, Voss snapped, but his voice had lost its edge. Henry guided his horse forward, stopping a few yards from Voss. I branded calves with you 20 years ago, Eli, back before you got that badge, back when you still had a soul. Don't make me shoot a man I once called friend. Voss stared at him. Then he looked at the men surrounding him, at the rifles pointed in his direction, at the hard faces of men who decided they weren't going to let cruelty run their county anymore. This isn't over, Voss said. Yeah, Henry replied, it is. Voss's hand hovered near his gun. For a moment, Gideon thought he'd draw, but then Voss exhaled sharply and turned his horse. Let's go, he muttered. The hired guns followed, silent and tense. They rode back down the road, dust swirling in their wake. Henry tipped his hat to Gideon. You good? Yeah, Gideon said. Thanks, Henry. Don't mention it, just, next time maybe don't buy trouble at an auction. Gideon almost smiled. I'll try. The riders turned and headed back into the trees, leaving Gideon and Sarah standing alone in the clearing. Sarah let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. They came for you, she said. They came for both of us. Why? Because out here, that's what people do, when it matters. Sarah looked at him, something shifting behind her eyes. Not forgiveness, not yet, but maybe the beginning of it. Weeks passed. Sarah stayed. She planted seeds in the small garden behind the house. She mended Gideon's shirts. She learned to ride Rust, hesitant at first, then more confident. Gideon built 2 small wooden crosses near the fence line overlooking the valley. He carved names into them by hand: Daniel Turner, Mary Turner, Jacob Turner. Sarah found him there one evening, kneeling in the grass. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly. I know. She knelt beside him. For a long time, they just sat there in silence, watching the sun dip below the horizon. I've been thinking, Sarah said, about what you said, about choices. Gideon waited. I think I'm ready to choose something, she said, for myself. What's that? Sarah looked at him. I want to stay, not because I have nowhere else to go, but because I think I want to see what it's like to have a home again. Gideon's throat tightened. You sure? No, Sarah admitted, but I want to try. Gideon nodded. Okay. She smiled, small, tentative, but real. You were right, you know, she said. You should have chosen me sooner. I know, Gideon said, but I'm glad I chose you now. Sarah reached out and touched the wooden cross. Then she stood and walked back toward the house, her silhouette framed against the fading light. Gideon stayed a moment longer, watching the sky turn from gold to violet. He thought about the man he'd been 8 years ago, the man who'd ridden away. And he thought about the man he was now, still flawed, still haunted, but trying. Somewhere in the valley, a coyote called. And Gideon Cole, for the first time in years, felt like maybe, just maybe, he could live with himself. The wind whispered through the pines, dust rose around his boots, and the ghosts of that night, while they'd never fully leave, seemed just a little quieter.